He had been waiting for this day for years. The moment he had dreamed about every time he wrote letters from overseas, every time he missed a birthday or a school play. His son was graduating and nothing in the world could keep him from being there. That morning he woke up early even before the sun. The house was quiet, and for a moment he sat at the edge of his bed, staring at his old army jacket hanging on the wall. The patches were faded, and the fabric had seen better days, but each thread carried a story. He reached for it gently, brushed off some dust, and smiled. "You've been through a lot," he whispered, half to himself. He didn't plan to make a big scene. He just wanted to show up, sit in the crowd and clap when his boy's name was called. It was a proud moment for him, not because of medals or honors, but because his son had done something he could never do while serving. Finish school without interruptions, without moving from base to base, without worry. He looked at himself in the mirror before leaving. The jacket fit a little tighter now, but he still stood tall. The medals on his chest glimmered in the morning light. He thought about leaving them off, but then decided against it. "These aren't for showing off," he told himself. "These are part of me." At the stadium gates, people were already gathering. Families dressed up, holding flowers and cameras. Laughter filled the air along with the smell of popcorn from a nearby stand. He smiled, holding his small flag folded neatly in his hand. When he reached the entrance, 2 security guards were checking bags and tickets. He handed over his invitation proudly, expecting no trouble. One of the guards looked him over, his eyes landing on the medals and flag. "Sir," the guard said, a little uncertain, "you can't bring that in." He frowned slightly, not sure what the guard meant. "Bring what?" "The flag and that jacket," the guard replied, pointing awkwardly. "We can't allow personal items like that. It's part of our event policy." He blinked, trying to understand. "This isn't just a personal item," he said quietly. "This jacket means something. I wore it while serving. And this flag, I carried it home." The guard looked uncomfortable. "I get that, sir, but rules are rules. We can't make exceptions." He took a slow breath, trying to stay calm. "Son," he said, his tone steady but tired, "I'm just here to see my boy graduate. I'm not here to cause trouble." The second guard, younger and stricter, stepped forward. "If you don't cooperate, we'll have to ask you to leave," he said firmly. His heart sank. People were beginning to look. Parents and students walked past, glancing at the scene but saying nothing. He felt the heat rising in his face, not from anger but from shame. He tried again. "Look, this jacket isn't dangerous. I served in it for years. I'm not breaking any law." The younger guard crossed his arms. "Sir, please step aside. You're holding up the line." He moved to the side quietly, not wanting to ruin anyone else's moment. He clutched the flag tightly, trying not to let his emotions show. Around him, families laughed and hugged while he stood alone, feeling out of place, like the world had forgotten what that jacket meant. He glanced toward the stadium. He could see rows of chairs, a large stage, and banners fluttering in the wind. Somewhere in that crowd was his son, ready to walk across the stage. He had promised he'd be there, sitting in the stands, waving that same flag. The thought of not keeping that promise hurt more than any wound he'd ever had. One of the guards called for a supervisor, still treating the situation like a rule violation instead of a misunderstanding. The man just stood there quiet, his pride wounded. He wanted to argue, but his voice wouldn't come out. He had faced enemy fire. He had seen comrades fall. But this somehow felt heavier. Not because of the rule itself, but because it felt like he didn't belong anymore. Like everything he stood for had no place in a simple celebration. People started whispering. A woman nearby leaned over to her husband. "That's not right," she murmured. A young boy pointed and asked, "Why are they stopping that man?" The father forced a small smile at the boy, pretending it didn't bother him. But inside, his chest felt tight. He looked at the guards and said softly, "If it makes you feel better, I can leave the flag outside. I just don't want to miss my son's moment." The guard hesitated. "Sorry, sir, the jacket too." His hand shook slightly as he looked down at it. "You want me to take off the jacket?" he asked quietly. "Yes, sir. It's part of the rule." He nodded slowly. "All right," he said, his voice breaking a little. "If that's what it takes." He started to unbutton it, his fingers trembling. The metals clinked softly as they moved. The sound cut through the air, sharp, metallic, and sad. A few people nearby stopped and watched. One of them, a man in a leather vest with a small patch that said veteran, frowned deeply. He recognized that look, the look of someone being disrespected for something sacred. But before anyone could step forward, a security truck pulled up and more guards came out. The situation was about to escalate. The father held the jacket in his hands, folded neatly, and placed it on a bench nearby. He kept the flag under his arm, his eyes fixed on the stadium where the first graduates were already walking. His son's name would be called soon. He didn't move. He didn't yell. He just stood there, quiet and alone. Then the man in the leather vest walked away, pulling out his phone. He didn't say a word to the guards. He just made a call. Something about the calmness of that moment felt strange, like the beginning of a storm that no one saw coming. The father didn't know it yet, but his story was about to change. The people he had once stood beside, the ones who knew what that jacket meant, were already on their way. And before the ceremony would end, the same place that had tried to push him out would soon stand still, watching in silence, as respect and pride walked through those gates together. The noise around the entrance grew louder. More families arrived, unaware of what was happening just a few steps away. The proud father stood near the gate, holding his folded jacket and flag close to his chest. The guards still kept an eye on him, whispering into their radios like he was some sort of problem. He didn't understand why things had gone this way. He wasn't angry at the guards, and not really. They were just doing their job, maybe a little too strictly, but deep inside he felt something heavy sitting in his chest. He had spent years defending his country, serving people he didn't even know, and now he couldn't even walk into his own son's graduation. The sound of the school band tuning up echoed from inside the stadium. He could hear the crowd cheering as the first group of graduates took their seats. His heart tightened. Every second that passed meant he was missing more of the moment he'd been waiting for. Nearby, some parents began to notice him. A few whispered to each other. "Isn't he a veteran?" one woman asked softly. Her husband nodded. "Looks like it." Poor guy. But they didn't move closer. Everyone seemed unsure of what to do, afraid of getting involved. He tried to distract himself by watching the flags fluttering above the stadium. They reminded him of his days overseas, standing shoulder to shoulder with his fellow soldiers in the harsh sun, believing that respect for the uniform was something that would never fade. The younger guard came up again. "Sir, if you don't leave the area, we'll have to escort you out." The father nodded slowly. "I'm not causing trouble," he said calmly. "Just waiting." "Waiting for what?" the guard asked, sounding irritated. "Waiting to see my son walk across that stage?" The guard sighed and looked away. "Rules are rules," he muttered before walking back to the gate. The father sat down on the bench near the entrance, setting his jacket beside him. The metals caught a bit of sunlight and glimmered softly. He ran his hand over them, remembering the friends he had lost, faces that never made it home. They had stood for honor, courage, and respect. But now, sitting there, he wondered what all of it truly meant if he couldn't even attend his son's graduation in peace. A teenage boy passed by with his mother, looked at the jacket and whispered, "Mom, that man's a soldier." The woman smiled sadly and said, "Yes, sweetheart, a very brave one." The boy smiled shyly at the father and gave him a small wave. It was a simple gesture, but it brought warmth to the man's heart. He smiled back, nodding in thanks. Minutes later, one of the security supervisors showed up, a tall man in a crisp shirt with a walkie-talkie on his belt. He looked serious, like someone who didn't like arguments. "Sir, I've been informed of the situation," he began. "You can attend the event, but you'll have to leave the jacket and flag here. We can't allow political symbols inside the venue." The father looked at him, confused. "Political symbols?" he asked quietly. "This flag isn't political. It's the same one that's flying over that stage right now." The supervisor hesitated, glancing at the flag in the man's hand. For a second, he looked unsure, but then his voice turned firm again. "Sir, I don't make the rules. I just follow them. Please cooperate." The father took a deep breath and stood up. His voice trembled slightly when he spoke. "Son, I've followed rules all my life. But this one doesn't make sense. I'm not here to protest anything. I'm just here to see my boy. I don't want to cause a scene." The supervisor said nothing. He simply motioned for the guard to stay near the man, then walked away. The crowd inside cheered again. The sound echoed through the entrance, sharp and distant, like a reminder of what he was missing. Then something caught his eye. Across the parking lot, a man in a leather vest stood watching him closely. He had been there earlier talking on his phone. The father didn't know him, but something about the man's expression felt familiar. That quiet look of understanding that only another veteran could carry. The man nodded slightly, almost like a promise. Then he turned and walked toward a group of people standing near their motorcycles. Within moments, a few of them began making calls of their own. Back at the gate, the father sat again, waiting, trying to keep his emotions under control. He thought of his son inside, probably scanning the crowd, looking for his face. The thought made his throat tighten. A woman from the crowd came closer and said softly, "Sir, if you'd like, I can hold your flag for you while you go inside." He smiled gently. "Thank you, ma'am, but this flag stays with me. Always has, always will." She nodded with respect and stepped back. Minutes ticked by. The sun climbed higher, the air growing warmer. The guards shifted uncomfortably, maybe realizing how wrong the situation looked. The younger one kept glancing toward the father, guilt flickering in his eyes. The father noticed, but he didn't say anything. He had learned long ago that silence can sometimes speak louder than words. Then a faint rumble echoed from the distance. At first it was barely noticeable, like faraway thunder. But soon the sound grew louder. The guards turned to look down the road. A line of motorcycles appeared, gleaming under the sun. The riders wore leather vests, some with patches that read Veterans Brotherhood. They rode slowly, side by side, forming a steady line that caught everyone's attention. People began to whisper, "Who are they? What's happening?" The guards straightened up, looking uneasy. The riders parked near the entrance, their engines falling silent one by one. The man in the vest who had been watching earlier walked toward the father. He didn't say anything at first, he just reached out his hand. The father stood and shook it firmly. "Brother," the rider said quietly, "we heard what's going on." The father looked surprised. "You didn't have to come," he said softly. The rider smiled faintly. "When one of us is disrespected, all of us show up. That's how it's always been." The guards exchanged nervous looks as more veterans stepped closer, forming a quiet circle around the father. Their presence wasn't loud or angry. It was calm, respectful, and powerful. People nearby stopped to watch. Some took pictures. Others began to clap softly, realizing they were witnessing something meaningful. The father felt a lump in his throat. He hadn't asked for help, yet here they were, men and women who understood what that jacket and flag meant. The rider turned to the guards and said, "This man isn't breaking any rule. He's honoring his son. And if you can't see the difference, maybe you should take another look at that flag above your gate." The words were firm but respectful. The guards didn't respond. They didn't have to. The moment spoke for itself. The father stood a little taller, feeling something he hadn't felt in years, belonging. And though the ceremony inside was still going on, everyone outside knew the real moment of pride was happening right there at the gate. The air around the stadium entrance grew still, as if everyone could sense something important was about to happen. The line of motorcycles had stopped near the gates, and the rumble of their engines had faded into silence. The sound alone had been enough to turn every head nearby. The proud father stood quietly among them, unsure how to react. He hadn't called anyone, hadn't asked for help, but here they were, his brothers and sisters in arms. Some he recognized from old reunions. Others were strangers, yet all of them shared the same look of respect. They didn't need to say much. Their presence said it all. One of the veterans, an older man with a calm but firm voice, stepped forward. He had a kind face but spoke with quiet authority. "What seems to be the problem here?" he asked the guards. The security supervisor cleared his throat, trying to sound confident. "This gentleman isn't following event policy. We asked him to remove his jacket and flag before entering." The veteran leader raised an eyebrow. "And why's that?" "It's standard procedure," the supervisor replied quickly. "No personal symbols or items that could cause disruption." The veteran nodded slowly, as if trying to give the man a chance to realize how ridiculous that sounded. Then he said, "That jacket he's wearing is not a symbol. It's his story. Every patch, every medal on it represents years of sacrifice. You see, he didn't buy that jacket in a store, he earned it." A quiet murmur spread through the onlookers. People had gathered around now, sensing something bigger than a small disagreement. Parents held their children closer, and a few whispered softly, explaining what the uniforms meant. The father stood behind the group, still holding his folded jacket and flag. He felt torn between pride and embarrassment. He hadn't wanted attention. He only wanted to see his son graduate. Yet now all eyes were on him. The veteran leader took a step closer to the guard. His tone wasn't angry, but there was weight behind every word. "You might not know this man," he said, "but you owe him the chance to see his son today. He wore that jacket while protecting this country, so people like you could have the freedom to work, to live, and to celebrate moments like this. The least you can do is show him the respect he deserves." The younger guard shifted uncomfortably, lowering his eyes. Even the supervisor looked uncertain now. The father tried to speak. "Please," he said softly, "I don't want any trouble. I just want to go in." The veteran beside him turned and placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "You're not causing trouble," he said gently. "You're standing for what's right. Let us handle this." A few more veterans joined them, creating a quiet wall of support behind him. One of them was a woman who had served overseas. She stepped forward and said, "We didn't come here to fight anyone. We came to remind people what respect looks like." The crowd began to clap, slowly at first, then louder. Someone shouted, "Let him in," and others repeated it. The security guards looked overwhelmed. They weren't bad people. They just didn't know how to handle the situation. Finally, the supervisor spoke again. "I need to talk to the event coordinator before I make a decision." He stepped away, radioing someone inside. While they waited, one of the veterans offered the father a small bottle of water. "You all right, brother?" he asked. The father smiled weakly. "I'm fine. Just didn't expect all this." The man chuckled. "You served long enough to know that family doesn't let family stand alone." The father nodded, his throat tight. "Thank you. I really mean it." Minutes later, the event coordinator, a woman dressed neatly with a clipboard in hand, arrived. She looked surprised by the crowd gathered near the entrance. The veterans stood still, their expressions calm but serious. "What's going on here?" she asked. The supervisor stepped forward nervously. "There was an issue about a jacket and flag. We were following protocol." The coordinator turned toward the father, her eyes softening when she saw the jacket in his hands. "Sir, are you a veteran?" "Yes, ma'am," he replied quietly. "I just came to see my son graduate. Didn't know it would cause this much trouble." She looked at him for a moment, then at the veterans standing around him. "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice full of regret. "There's been a misunderstanding." "Of course you're welcome here, with your jacket and your flag." A wave of relief washed over the crowd. The veterans exchanged satisfied nods. Some of the parents nearby clapped again, louder this time. But the father didn't rush to move. He stood there, still holding the jacket close to his chest. "I don't want anyone to get in trouble because of me," he said gently. The coordinator smiled warmly. "No one's in trouble, sir. In fact, we should be thanking you for your service and for raising a son who's graduating today." Her words hit him deeply. He blinked back tears as he slowly put the jacket back on. The metals clinked softly, catching the sunlight once more. The veterans around him saluted quietly. The crowd cheered again. It wasn't a loud or wild kind of cheer. It was the kind that came from the heart, full of respect. Even some of the guards joined in, realizing the mistake and clapping along. The coordinator turned to the guards and said kindly, "Next time, remember that rules are made to keep people safe, not to keep honor out." The father smiled faintly, shaking hands with the men and women who had stood up for him. "You didn't have to come," he said again, still overwhelmed. One of them grinned. "We always come when one of our own needs us. That's how it's always been." As he finally walked through the gates, escorted by his fellow veterans, the people in line stepped aside to let them pass. Some placed their hands over their hearts, while others simply nodded in respect. The father felt his chest swell with pride, not just for his service, but for the bond that still lived strong among those who had served beside him. Inside the stadium, music filled the air. The announcer was calling names one by one. He looked around, searching for his son among the rows of graduates. When he spotted him wearing his cap and gown, standing tall and scanning the crowd, the father raised his small flag high in the air. His son's eyes found him instantly. A wide smile spread across his face, and he gave a small salute from the stage. The father's heart felt full. Everything he had gone through that day, every bit of embarrassment, every harsh word, it was all worth it. The veteran stayed by his side quietly, watching the ceremony as if it were their own family up there. To them, it was more than just a graduation. It was a moment that reminded everyone watching that respect, once earned, should never be taken away. And for the first time in a long while, the proud father felt like the world still remembered what that old jacket really stood for. The crowd inside the stadium was full of excitement and pride. Families waved to their children, calling out names, taking pictures, and holding flowers high in the air. On one side of the stands, a group of people stood out, a small cluster of veterans sitting proudly beside the father who had finally been allowed in. He sat quietly, his heart still racing from everything that had happened outside. His jacket rested neatly on his shoulders again, and his hand held the small flag he had refused to let go of. Around him, the other veterans had settled down, some still wearing their old caps and badges, some in plain clothes. They weren't loud or demanding. They just sat there with quiet dignity, their presence strong but calm. As the next group of graduates walked onto the stage, his son appeared among them. For a moment, the noise of the crowd seemed to fade. All he could see was his boy, tall, confident, with that familiar smile that reminded him so much of the mother who had stood by them through every tough year. The father leaned forward, gripping the flag tighter. His throat tightened and his eyes burned, but he refused to look away. His son's eyes scanned the crowd nervously, searching. Then he saw him, his father, standing among a group of men and women in uniform. The moment their eyes met, the boy froze, his expression changing from confusion to pride. He straightened his back and gave a small, respectful nod. The father felt tears slide down his face, and he didn't even try to hide them. For all the battles he'd fought, this one moment, being there for his son, felt like the victory that mattered most. The announcer called his son's name. The crowd cheered, and the father stood up, raising his flag high in the air. The veterans around him followed, some saluting, others clapping. The moment turned heads. Even people who didn't know the story began to cheer louder, drawn in by the sight of a proud father standing tall with his flag waving proudly above the crowd. When his son received his diploma, he looked straight at his father and gave a small salute. The stadium went quiet for a second, then erupted into applause. Even the announcer paused, touched by the gesture. After the ceremony ended, people began to leave their seats. The father stayed for a moment, still soaking in everything that had just happened. He felt his hand being gently squeezed. One of the veterans beside him smiled and said, "You did good, brother." He smiled back, his eyes still misty. "Couldn't have done it without you all." They walked together toward the exit, their pace slow but steady. Outside, the same guards who had once stopped him now stood silently, their faces red with embarrassment. One of them took off his cap and said quietly, "Sir, I'm really sorry for how we treated you earlier. We didn't know." The father looked at him for a long moment, then smiled softly. "Son, respect is something you show before you're told to, but I appreciate your words." The young guard nodded, clearly humbled. Nearby, the woman who had been in charge of the event came over, carrying a small bouquet of flowers. "Sir," she said kindly, "we want to make it right. Would you allow us to honor you and your fellow veterans next year at the graduation ceremony?" He seemed surprised. "You don't have to do that," he said. She shook her head. "We want to. Today reminded us of something important, that freedom and respect come from the sacrifices of people like you. We'll make sure every student learns that before they walk across that stage." The father didn't say anything for a moment. He just looked around at the families taking pictures, the graduates laughing with friends, and the flag fluttering gently above the stadium. Then he said quietly, "If that lesson reaches even one of these young people, then it's worth more than any ceremony." The woman smiled warmly. "It already has, sir." As they left the stadium, the veterans gathered near their motorcycles again. The sound of engines revving filled the air. Before leaving, one of them called out, "We'll see you at the next meeting, brother." "Don't be late." The father chuckled, shaking his head. "Wouldn't miss it." He stood there for a moment, watching them ride off, the sunlight glinting off their helmets and badges. When the last motorcycle disappeared down the road, he turned back toward the stadium. His son was walking toward him, still holding his diploma tightly in one hand. When they met, neither said a word at first. His son simply hugged him, a long, tight hug that said everything words couldn't. The father rested his hand on the back of his son's head, whispering, "I'm proud of you, son." "So proud." His son pulled back slightly, smiling through tears. "I saw what happened at the gate," he said softly. "People told me. I was so worried they wouldn't let you in." The father smiled. "They tried. he said with a small laugh. But your old man's got friends in strong places. His son laughed too, the tension melting away. They all came for you? For us, the father said. Because when you serve, you never really stand alone. They walked to the car together, arm in arm. The jacket on his shoulders felt lighter now, as if the weight of the day had lifted something more than just fabric. It felt like the world had remembered what it meant to respect someone's story, and that was something he'd never forget. As they drove home, the car was filled with laughter and stories. His son talked about his future plans, about college and dreams, while the father listened quietly, smiling to himself. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. When they finally reached home, the father placed his flag carefully on the table, beside a photo of his old unit. The sunlight from the window touched the edge of the fabric, making it glow softly. He took off his jacket and hung it back on the same hook where it had been that morning. But this time it didn't look like an old piece of his past. It looked alive again, a part of a story that had found its ending. He stood there for a long moment staring at it. Then he whispered, "We did good today." From outside, the faint sound of motorcycles echoed in the distance, his brothers in arms heading home, just as proud as he was. And though the day had started with misunderstanding and pain, it ended with something stronger: unity, respect, and love. It was a day his son would tell his children about one day, the day a proud dad stood tall, his brothers stood with him, and the world remembered the true meaning of honor. The days after the graduation ceremony felt different for everyone. For the father, life had finally slowed down. The noise, the stress, and even the hurt from that morning were fading away. But what stayed in his heart was pride, not just for his son, but for what had happened that day. He still remembered the crowd cheering, his son's salute, and the moment when the veterans rode in together. That memory was like a bright flame that kept him smiling every time he thought about it. A few days later, his phone buzzed early in the morning. It was a message from one of the veterans who had stood beside him at the ceremony. The message said, "Brother, you made the front page." He frowned, curious, and opened the news link. There it was. A picture of him standing in the crowd holding his flag high as his son saluted from the stage. The headline read, "Veterans Stand with Proud Father After Graduation Mix-Up." The article told the whole story, how the father had been stopped by security because of a misunderstanding, how his brothers in arms had come to support him, and how the crowd had turned that moment into something beautiful. It described the quiet respect that had filled the stadium, and how one simple act of love and loyalty had reminded everyone about true honor. He scrolled through the comments expecting harsh words. But to his surprise, there were hundreds of kind messages. People wrote things like, "This made me cry, and this man deserves all the respect in the world." One person even wrote, "My dad is a veteran too. I'm going to call him right now and tell him I love him." The father sat back in his chair, speechless. He hadn't done anything for fame or attention. He had only wanted to see his son graduate. But now somehow that small moment had touched people across the country. Later that week, his son came home, still glowing with happiness from graduation. He had seen the article too and couldn't stop talking about it. "Dad," he said, "people at school are talking about you. My teachers, my friends, everyone said what you did was amazing." The father chuckled softly. "I didn't do anything special, son. I just showed up." His son smiled and shook his head. "No, Dad, you showed the world what respect looks like. And you taught me more in that one day than school ever could." The father didn't say anything after that. He just smiled, his heart full. That evening, they sat on the porch together, watching the sun go down. The warm light painted the sky with shades of orange and gold. His son leaned back in his chair, sighing deeply. "You know, I've been thinking," he said. "Maybe I want to follow in your footsteps, and not exactly the same way, but I want to do something that matters." The father turned to him. "You already do. You finished something important. That's the first step. But if you really want to make a difference, do it with kindness. That's what lasts." His son nodded slowly, understanding. A week later, the father received an invitation in the mail. It was from the same woman who had spoken to him after the graduation, the event organizer. She had written personally, inviting him to speak at a local school event about respect and service. At first, he wasn't sure if he wanted to go. Public speaking wasn't his thing. He had always been a man of few words, letting his actions speak for him. But then he remembered all those kind messages from strangers, and he thought, maybe his story could help someone else. So he agreed. The day of the event, he arrived at the school gym wearing his cleanest shirt and that same jacket that had caused so much trouble before, but this time he wore it proudly. When he walked onto the small stage, the students clapped and the teachers smiled warmly. He looked out at all the young faces and began softly, "I'm not here to talk about war or medals. I'm here to talk about respect, the kind you show before someone earns it." He told them about that day at the stadium, how things went wrong at first, but how it turned into something good. He talked about forgiveness, about standing together, and about how pride doesn't mean arrogance. It means love for what you stand for. The students listened quietly, really listening. When he finished, the gym was silent for a moment, then filled with applause. A few students even stood up, clapping harder than the rest. Afterward, some came up to shake his hand. One girl said, "My grandpa's a veteran too. I didn't really understand what he went through until now." "Thank you," he smiled, his eyes soft. "You just made his service count even more," he told her. That night, when he got home, he found his son waiting for him with a big grin. "Mom told me you gave a speech," his son said proudly. "I knew you'd inspire people," the father laughed. "I don't know about inspire. I just told the truth." His son handed him a small box. "Open it." Inside was a photo frame, a picture of that moment at graduation when his son saluted and he stood holding the flag. Under it, his son had written a simple line, "Thank you for showing me what honor really means." The father's throat tightened as he looked at it. "You didn't have to do this," his son smiled. "I wanted to. You deserve it." The father placed the frame beside his old medals on the shelf. For the first time in years, the medals didn't seem like reminders of old battles. They looked like symbols of love, strength, and unity. That night, as he sat alone with a cup of tea, he thought about everything that had happened. The misunderstanding, the support, the pride. All of it had led to something bigger than he could have imagined. Sometimes, he realized, life brings trouble just to show what's worth fighting for. And sometimes all it takes is one act of love, one moment of courage, to remind people of what really matters. He smiled to himself, whispering, "We didn't just stand up for one man that day. We stood up for respect." Outside, the night was calm. The flag in front of his house moved gently in the breeze, the stars shining above it. And somewhere deep inside, the proud dad knew his story wasn't just his anymore. It belonged to everyone who believed in doing what's right, no matter how small the moment might seem. The next morning when he woke up, the first thing he saw was that framed picture. He smiled, took a deep breath, and whispered, "Time to make today count too," because for him, every day from then on wasn't just another ordinary day. It was another chance to live with pride, love, and quiet strength, the same way he always had and always would.